Imagine standing inside a Mughal court in the early 17th century. The air is thick with incense and the faint scent of rosewater. Sunlight filters through carved marble screens and falls in delicate patterns across the polished floor. Courtiers stand in disciplined silence, dressed in silk and brocade, each man aware that he is standing at the center of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. Beyond the walls, armies are moving. Revenues are being counted, alliances are being negotiated. And somewhere behind another set of walls live the women of the Mughal household. Women history has taught us to imagine as distant shadows, silent figures hidden behind curtains. Confined to Purdah, removed from power and public life. Yet this image that feels so old and unquestionable is not Mughal, it is colonial. It was shaped centuries later by British officials and historians who looked back at the empire with their own political needs and moral assumptions. They searched for evidence that Mughal society was backward and incapable of self-rule. And the image of the secluded Muslim woman became one of their most powerful symbols. If Mughal women were oppressed, then Mughal civilization could be declared inferior. And if it was inferior, then empire could be justified as progress. But when we step into Mughal India itself, when we listen to court chronicles, travel accounts, farmans, letters, and architectural spaces, a far more complex and unsettling reality begins to emerge. Because Purdah in Mughal India did not mean disappearance, it meant regulation of access. It meant control over who could see and who could be seen. It meant the management of space rather than the erasure of presence. Elite Mughal women observed Purdah not because they lacked power, but because they possessed it. Privacy itself was a marker of status in pre-modern societies. A woman who did not need to labor publicly was a woman whose household possessed wealth, servants, and influence. Common women could not afford strict seclusion. They worked in fields, markets, workshops, and homes. They moved through streets and towns because their labor sustained the empire. So from the very beginning, the idea that all Mughal women lived the same confined life collapses under its own weight. There was no single Mughal female experience. Class mattered, rank mattered, proximity to power mattered. The zenana, which popular imagination reduces to a prison, was in reality a vast and complex institution. It was not a single room, but an entire world within the palace, populated by royal women, attendants, administrators, guards, tutors, physicians, artists, messengers, and servants. It functioned as a parallel court. Orders were issued from within it. Petitions were received. Correspondence flowed in and out. Wealth was managed. Estates were supervised. Marriages were arranged, and political alliances were quietly shaped. To describe the zenana as private is not to describe it as powerless, because in Mughal political culture, power did not always operate through public visibility. It often operated through proximity, access, and influence. Those closest to the emperor, even if unseen, could shape decisions more effectively than those standing openly in court. Modern assumptions teach us that freedom must be visible and power must be loud. Mughal society did not share this assumption. Authority could be exercised quietly. Influence could move through trusted intermediaries, and presence did not require exposure. A woman behind a screen could control jagirs and revenue assignments. A woman in Purdah could issue imperial orders through trusted agents. A woman unseen could influence succession politics and diplomatic strategy. The mistake of colonial historians was not simply bias, but misunderstanding. They judged Mughal society using Western standards of visibility and public participation. And when they did not find women speaking in assemblies or marching in processions, they assumed absence rather than difference. They confused unfamiliar forms of power with lack of power itself. Mughal chronicles themselves never describe elite women as irrelevant. They record their patronage, their interventions, their wealth, and their authority in careful detail. Travelers who entered Mughal India were often astonished by the scale and organization of the women's quarters, noting that they functioned like administrative centers rather than domestic retreats. The architecture itself tells this story. High walls and screens were not simply barriers, but instruments that regulated gaze and movement, controlling who could enter and who could leave, who could see and who must remain unseen. This was not passivity, but control of space. And space in an imperial court was power. To understand Purdah, we must abandon the idea that it was a single rigid system imposed uniformly on women. It was a flexible practice shaped by circumstance, rank, and context. Royal women traveling with the court observed Purdah differently from those residing permanently in palaces. Women appearing in religious spaces observed different norms from those in administrative contexts. Even within the zenana, levels of access varied. Senior women enjoyed authority over junior women, over servants, over estates, and sometimes over men who acted as their agents. Purdah did not erase hierarchy, it organized it. And this organization allowed elite Mughal women to operate within protected spaces while remaining deeply connected to the political and economic life of the empire. The tragedy of later historical narratives is that they flattened this complexity into a single image of confinement, an image that has been repeated so often that it feels natural, inevitable, and timeless, but it is none of those things. It is a story written after the empire had already fallen, written by those who never stood inside a Mughal court or walked through a zenana as a living institution, written by observers who mistook silence for absence and privacy for oppression. And as we begin this journey into Mughal women and Purdah, we must do one difficult thing. We must let go of the comforting simplicity of inherited images, and instead allow the Mughal world to speak for itself. Because only then can we begin to understand that Mughal women were not invisible. They were selectively visible. Their power did not disappear behind curtains. It moved through them, quietly, deliberately, shaping an empire from within. Now imagine moving deeper into the Mughal palace, past the outer courts and public halls, into spaces that were never meant for spectacle. Spaces where decisions were not announced but shaped, where power did not raise its voice but waited, listened, and redirected. Because Mughal rule was not sustained by the emperor alone. It was sustained by networks, families, loyalties, and trust. And within those networks, Mughal women occupied positions far more central than history later allowed them. The Mughal state was built on personal relationships, on access to the emperor, on influence exercised through proximity rather than public office. And this structure created openings where women could wield authority without ever appearing in court. The imperial household was not separate from the state. It was the state. Decisions about revenue, appointments, marriages, succession, and diplomacy flowed through domestic spaces. And Mughal women were deeply embedded in these flows. Royal women controlled vast jagirs, revenue assignments that generated enormous wealth. These lands were not symbolic gifts but functioning economic units, producing income that women managed through agents, accountants, and officials. This financial independence translated directly into political leverage, because wealth meant the ability to reward loyalty, support factions, and influence outcomes. When a noble sought advancement, when a courtier needed protection, when a dispute required mediation, royal women often became the quiet centers of negotiation. Petitions were sent into the zenana, requests were conveyed through trusted intermediaries, and decisions returned outward carrying imperial weight. This was not informal power in the sense of weakness. It was institutionalized power operating through different channels. Nur Jahan stands as the most visible example, but she was not an exception. She was a revelation of what had always been possible. During Jahangir's reign, her authority became unmistakable. Coins were struck in her name, imperial orders carried her seal. Ambassadors recognized her influence, and yet even her power did not emerge suddenly. It grew from structures that already existed, from accepted roles of senior women within the household. Nur Jahan's visibility shocked later historians because it contradicted their assumptions. But to her contemporaries, her authority was legible, understandable, and grounded in Mughal norms. Before and after her, women like Jahanara Begum exercised immense influence. Jahanara was not merely a princess, she was Shah Jahan's closest confidant, a woman entrusted with managing trade, supervising ports, and representing imperial interests. She sponsored mosques, gardens, caravanserais, and scholars. Her wealth rivaled that of leading nobles, and her role in succession politics during Aurangzeb's rise was decisive. Succession in the Mughal Empire was never automatic, it was violent, contested, and uncertain. Brothers fought brothers, alliances shifted rapidly, and survival depended on support from powerful actors. Royal women were among the most important of those actors. Mothers, sisters, and senior women acted as negotiators, advisors, and protectors. They secured resources, brokered alliances, and sometimes attempted reconciliation. Their interventions could save lives or seal deaths. And they operated from within Purdah, not because they were excluded from politics, but because that was where political power was concentrated. Foreign travelers often misunderstood this dynamic. They looked for women in public councils and did not find them. And so they assumed absence. But Mughal governance did not rely on councils alone. It relied on access, intimacy, and trust. The emperor's private world mattered more than his public performances. And women dominated that private world. Education played a crucial role in this authority. Elite Mughal women were literate, multilingual, and trained in courtly culture. They read Persian poetry, religious texts, histories, and ethical treatises. They understood diplomacy, patronage, and symbolism. Their letters reveal sharp political awareness and strategic thinking. They knew when to intervene and when to remain silent. Restraint itself was a form of power, because intervention carried weight precisely because it was rare. Mughal men did not perceive this as unnatural. It was part of the imperial household's logic. Senior women were expected to guide, advise, and sometimes restrain male relatives. This expectation was woven into familial duty, not rebellion against it. The idea that Purdah erased women from politics collapses entirely when we examine how Mughal power actually functioned. Because Purdah regulated visibility, not influence. It controlled who could approach women directly, forcing all interaction through trusted channels. This filtering increased authority rather than diminished it. Access became a privilege, not a right, and those who controlled access controlled outcomes. Colonial historians struggled to understand this because they equated power with formal office. But Mughal governance was personal, relational, and household-based. The empire was ruled as much from behind screens as from thrones. And this was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. When British observers later described Mughal women as imprisoned, they were projecting their own anxieties onto a structure they did not comprehend. They saw walls and assumed oppression. But those walls also protected autonomy, dignity, and leverage. Mughal women were not fighting to escape these spaces because those spaces were the source of their authority. To step into public view would often have meant losing power rather than gaining it. Visibility exposed one to attack, gossip, and loss of influence. Privacy preserved control. And this understanding shaped how Mughal women navigated their world. They were not passive inhabitants of Purdah. They were skilled operators within it. And as we move forward in this story, we will see how this power extended beyond the palace into trade, religion, architecture, and everyday life. Because Purdah did not end Mughal women's influence. It structured it, refined it, and in many cases amplified it. And only by recognizing this can we begin to see Mughal women not as shadows but as architects of empire moving quietly through history. Now imagine the rhythm of everyday life unfolding inside the Mughal world. Not the dramatic moments of court politics, but the steady patterns that shaped how women lived, learned, worked, and moved through time. Because history often focuses on extraordinary figures, while forgetting that power is sustained through ordinary routines. Inside the zenana, life followed an organized structure rather than idle isolation. Mornings began with prayer and ritual. Women gathered for religious recitation, discussion, and reflection. Faith was not only personal but communal. Senior women guided younger ones in religious practice. Ethics and discipline. Education formed a central part of daily life. Elite Mughal women were taught to read and write Persian, the language of administration and culture. Many also learned Arabic for religious study. Poetry was memorized, histories were read aloud. Letters were composed and dictated. Tutors entered the zenana under strict protocol to instruct women in literature, theology, mathematics, and etiquette. This education was not ornamental. It prepared women to manage estates, oversee finances, and understand the political world their male relatives inhabited. Writing was a daily activity. Correspondence flowed constantly between the zenana and the outer court. Letters carried advice, requests, warnings, and strategic recommendations. Messengers moved in and out with practiced efficiency. Life inside was anything but silent. It was filled with conversation, debate, planning, and negotiation. Alongside intellectual life, there was economic labor. Mughal women managed workshops that produced textiles, embroidery, perfumes, and luxury goods. These were not hobbies but revenue-generating enterprises connected to imperial markets. Women supervised production through trusted servants and managers. Quality was inspected, prices were negotiated, profits were reinvested. Some women developed reputations for particular crafts, their products sought after by nobles and merchants. This economic activity strengthened autonomy because financial independence reinforced political leverage. Daily life also involved care and governance of people. The zenana housed hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals. From servants to attendants to guards, managing this population required administrative skill. Disputes were resolved, duties assigned, discipline enforced. Justice was administered within the household. Senior women functioned as judges and managers, their authority recognized and enforced. Outside the palace walls, common women lived very different lives. But their experiences were no less complex. Peasant women worked alongside men in agriculture, planting, harvesting, tending animals. Their labor sustained the empire's food supply. Artisan women worked in weaving, pottery, dyeing, and food preparation. Many ran small businesses from their homes. Market women bought and sold goods, negotiated prices, formed networks of mutual support. These women did not observe strict Purdah. They covered themselves according to custom, but moved freely through public spaces. Their visibility was necessary for survival. Mughal society accepted this variation as natural. Purdah was never intended to erase women from economic life. It adapted to circumstance. Religious life connected women across classes. Women visited shrines, participated in festivals, made charitable donations. Sufi spaces in particular allowed women significant presence. Shrines became places where class boundaries softened and women sought spiritual guidance, healing, and blessing. Mughal women were major patrons of religious institutions. They funded mosques, dargahs, madrasas, and charitable kitchens. These acts were not merely pious but political. Patronage created loyalty, shaped urban landscapes, and inscribed women's names into the physical fabric of the empire. Architecture itself reveals women's presence. Gardens commissioned by royal women became centers of social life. Caravanserais funded by women facilitated trade and travel. Public works carried inscriptions bearing women's titles and prayers. Yet later historians often ignored these markers. because they did not fit the narrative of seclusion. Daily life also involved emotion. Relationships, love, rivalry, grief, and joy. Mughal women formed intense bonds with sisters, daughters, companions, and servants. Friendships were cultivated. Rivalries managed. Alliances maintained. The zenana was not a harmonious utopia, but a human space filled with tension and negotiation. Senior women balanced compassion with authority, favoritism with fairness. Mistakes could be costly, and skill lay in maintaining equilibrium. Child rearing was a central responsibility. Mothers oversaw the education and moral formation of princes and princesses. Early lessons shaped future rulers. Women influenced values, loyalties, and worldviews long before men entered formal political training. The imprint of mothers and grandmothers can be traced in the decisions of emperors. Yet this influence rarely appears in official chronicles because it unfolded before history's gaze. Outside elite circles, women faced different challenges: widowhood, illness, poverty, and violence were real threats, but women were not helpless. Family networks provided support. Community structures offered protection. Islamic law granted women rights to property, inheritance, and legal recourse. Women appeared in courts to assert these rights. Judges recognized their claims. Legal documents record women buying, selling, and inheriting property. These records complicate the image of total confinement. Purdah did not strip women of legal identity. It coexisted with rights and responsibilities. Daily clothing practices also reveal flexibility. Women adapted dress to context, heavier veiling in formal or elite spaces, lighter coverings in work environments. Norms shifted across regions and periods. Mughal India was vast and diverse. Practices in Agra differed from Lahore. From the Deccan, from Bengal, there was no single template. What united these varied lives was not confinement, but negotiation. Women constantly negotiated boundaries between visibility and privacy, safety and influence, tradition and opportunity. This negotiation required intelligence and adaptability. Mughal women were not resisting Purdah as an external force imposed upon them. They were using it as a framework within which they exercised agency. The tragedy of later retellings is that they reduced this dynamic world into a static image. A woman frozen behind a screen, stripped of voice and complexity. But when we slow down and observe daily life, we see movement everywhere: labor, learning, devotion, management, care, strategy, and ambition. Mughal women lived within constraints, but they were not defined by them. They shaped their world from inside it. And as we continue this journey, we will see how these everyday practices fed directly into larger structures of power, myth-making, and historical distortion. Because it was only after the empire's fall that these lives were flattened into silence. The Mughal world beginning to fade, not through sudden collapse, but through slow erosion. As imperial authority weakens and new eyes begin to study the empire, not to understand it, but to replace it. Because when power changes hands, history itself is rewritten. And in 19th century India, British administrators, missionaries, travelers, and scholars began to look back at Mughal society with a very specific purpose. They were not neutral observers. They were rulers in the making, and to rule they needed a story. A story that explained why Mughal India had failed and why British rule was necessary. And in this story, the figure of the Mughal woman became central. British writers arrived carrying assumptions shaped by Victorian morality, where female respectability was tied to domestic seclusion, yet paradoxically framed as moral weakness when applied outside Europe. They saw Purdah and interpreted it through their own anxieties, turning privacy into oppression and difference into deficiency. They did not ask how Mughal society functioned on its own terms. They asked how it differed from theirs, and difference became evidence of backwardness. Colonial ethnographies describe zenanas as dark, stagnant spaces, ignoring their administrative complexity. Missionaries portrayed Muslim women as imprisoned souls in need of rescue. Political reports framed Purdah as proof that Muslim society was inherently regressive, incapable of reform without external intervention. These narratives circulated widely, shaping British public opinion and policy. And once written, they hardened into truth. Because empire does not only conquer land, it conquers memory. Mughal women, who had once been recorded as patrons, landholders, mediators, and strategists, were reduced to stereotypes. Their letters dismissed as curiosities. Their economic power ignored, their political influence erased. Colonial historians preferred dramatic contrasts. They juxtaposed the supposed freedom of Western women against the imagined imprisonment of Eastern women. Even though Victorian women themselves lived under severe legal and social restrictions, this contradiction did not matter. What mattered was constructing a moral hierarchy with Britain at the top and Mughal women at the bottom. Education systems reinforced this view. Textbooks simplified complex histories into moral lessons. Mughal Purdah became shorthand for everything colonial rule claimed to correct. Indian reform debates were also shaped by this pressure. Local elites internalized colonial critiques and began to view their own traditions through imperial eyes. Some reformers argued that Purdah itself was the root of decline. Others defended it uncritically. But both sides were now reacting to a colonial frame rather than Mughal reality. The nuance of earlier practices disappeared. Women's lived experiences were flattened into symbols in a political argument. Archival silences grew. British officials rarely consulted women's voices directly. They relied on male informants, translators, and elite intermediaries who often projected their own views. What could not be easily observed was assumed not to exist. Influence exercised quietly was dismissed as absence. Colonial modernity privileged visibility, documentation, and formal office. Everything else was treated as informal and therefore insignificant. Even architecture was reinterpreted. Screens and walls, once understood as instruments of spatial control, were now read as cages. Mobility managed through protocol was read as immobility. The zenana transformed in the colonial imagination from an administrative center into a harem, a word loaded with exoticism and moral judgment. Travel literature sensationalized women's spaces, turning them into spectacles for Western consumption. Imagination replaced evidence, fantasy replaced documentation. And these accounts fed into a global discourse that continues today. The persistence of this myth lies in its simplicity. It offers a clear villain and a clear victim. But history rarely conforms to such clarity. Mughal women did not experience Purdah as a single oppressive system. They experienced it as a shifting set of practices negotiated daily. But colonial narratives erased negotiation itself. They presented Mughal women as passive recipients of tradition rather than active participants in shaping it. This erasure had consequences. Once Mughal women were imagined as silent and powerless. Their absence from later nationalist histories seemed natural. Historians searching for heroes looked for public actors and did not find women because they were not looking in the right places. Influence exercised through family, patronage, and correspondence did not fit the heroic mold. So it was excluded. The myth fed upon itself. Repeated often enough, it became common sense. Modern media inherited these assumptions. Films and dramas recycled colonial imagery, reinforcing the idea of the veiled woman as timeless and static. Even well-intentioned critiques often reproduce the same frame, by assuming that liberation must look Western to be real. What is lost in this process is Mughal women's own understanding of agency, their strategies of survival and influence, their ability to navigate constraints creatively. Colonial history did not merely misunderstand Purdah. It froze it, stripped it of context, movement, and meaning. And by doing so, it turned living practices into dead symbols. As we confront this distortion, we are not simply correcting an error. We are recovering a way of seeing power that does not rely on visibility alone. Because the Mughal world reminds us that influence can be quiet, authority can be indirect, and agency can exist within structures rather than only in opposition to them. And until we dismantle the colonial lens through which Mughal women have been viewed, we will continue to mistake absence for silence and privacy for powerlessness. And it is only after peeling away these layers of distortion that we can approach the final question of this journey. Not whether Mughal women lived behind Purdah, but whether Purdah itself has been misunderstood as history rather than ideology. Now imagine stepping back from the palace walls and watching the Mughal world as a whole, not as a frozen image in a textbook, but as a living, breathing civilization unfolding across generations. Because when we ask whether Mughal women were really confined to Purdah, we are not asking a simple historical question. We are asking how power works, how history remembers, and how silence is interpreted. The Mughal Empire was built on relationships rather than institutions alone, on households rather than parliaments, on intimacy rather than spectacle. And within this structure, women were never peripheral, they were central. Yet their centrality did not always announce itself in ways modern observers recognize. Mughal women operated within a system that valued control of space over occupation of public platforms, influence over visibility, discretion over display. This was not accidental. It was a strategic adaptation to a political culture where exposure could mean vulnerability, where survival depended on managing access and proximity. Purdah, in this context, was not a wall separating women from power, but a membrane through which power moved selectively, filtering information, requests, alliances, and decisions. Mughal women understood this deeply. They cultivated patience, timing, and restraint. They knew when to intervene and when silence would speak louder. They understood that authority could be exercised through trust rather than command, through presence rather than performance. And this understanding shaped how they lived their lives, educated their children, managed their wealth, and navigated crisis. When succession wars erupted, women became mediators and strategists. When emperors faltered, women stabilized governance. When alliances threatened to fracture, women negotiated reconciliation. Yet because these actions rarely unfolded in public spaces, they were later treated as marginal. History privileged the loud over the quiet, the visible over the effective. And in doing so, it erased entire forms of agency. The tragedy of Mughal women's history is not that they lacked power, but that later narratives lacked the tools to see it. Colonial historians mistook difference for deficiency. Nationalist histories prioritized masculine public heroism, and modern retellings inherited both frames, resulting in a flattened image of Mughal women as timeless victims of tradition. But when we return to Mughal sources themselves, a different picture emerges. Women writing letters filled with political calculation. Women commissioning architecture that reshaped cities. Women managing estates that funded armies and courts. Women influencing emperors not through rebellion but through intimacy and counsel. These were not isolated figures, but products of a system that recognized women as stakeholders in empire. Mughal society did not imagine women as equal to men in modern terms, but it did not imagine them as irrelevant either. It assigned them roles that were powerful precisely because they were embedded within family, religion, and household authority. Purdah structured these roles, it did not negate them. And to judge this system solely by modern standards of visibility is to misunderstand it entirely. History does not move in straight lines toward a single idea of freedom. Societies create different solutions to the same problems. Security, legitimacy, continuity, and Mughal India created one such solution. Imperfect, hierarchical, constrained, but functional and meaningful to those who lived within it. Mughal women did not experience Purdah as a prison imposed from outside. They experienced it as a framework they learned to navigate, manipulate, and sometimes benefit from. This does not mean their lives were easy or free from suffering. Patriarchy existed, violence existed, injustice existed. But oppression is not defined solely by seclusion. And agency is not defined solely by visibility. The danger of simplistic narratives is that they erase complexity. They replace lived experience with moral shorthand. And once that happens, understanding becomes impossible. As viewers of history, we inherit a responsibility to slow down, to question inherited images, and to allow past societies to speak in their own languages rather than ours. When we do this with Mughal women, we begin to see them not as shadows behind screens, but as actors, operating within a different grammar of power. A grammar that valued discretion, intimacy, and continuity. And perhaps the most important lesson of this story is not about Mughal women alone, but about history itself. About how easily silence is confused with absence. How quickly privacy is labeled oppression. And how often power hides in places we are not trained to look. The Mughal Empire eventually fell, its palaces faded, its courts emptied. But the stories written about it outlived the empire itself. And among those stories, the image of the confined Mughal woman became one of the most enduring. Yet endurance does not equal truth. And if we listen carefully, beneath the layers of colonial judgment and modern assumption, another voice emerges, quieter but persistent, telling us that Mughal women were never simply confined. They were positioned. They were not erased. They were rearranged within a system that understood power differently. And to truly understand them, we must be willing to rethink our own definitions of freedom, agency, and visibility. Because history does not owe us comfort, it owes us honesty. And the honest story of Mughal women is not one of silence, but of carefully managed voice. Not of disappearance, but of selective presence. Not of powerlessness, but of power exercised in ways that modern eyes are only beginning to relearn how to see. Now imagine the silence that follows after an empire ends. Not the dramatic silence of battlefields, but the quieter silence of rooms once filled with voices. The Mughal palaces still standing, their walls intact, their screens unmoved. Yet the lives that once animated them gone. And it is in this silence that historical memory is reshaped. Because when power disappears, interpretation rushes in to fill the space. Mughal women did not vanish when the empire weakened. But the structures that made their power legible began to dissolve. Estates were broken up, households fragmented, patronage networks collapsed, and the private channels through which women once exercised influence lost their effectiveness. Without these structures, later observers could no longer see how authority had once functioned. And what cannot be seen is often assumed never to have existed. This is how forgetting begins. Not through deliberate erasure alone, but through structural collapse that makes past agency unintelligible to the present. British rule did not merely replace Mughal administration. It replaced Mughal ways of organizing social life. Governance shifted from households to bureaucracies, from personal networks to formal offices, from intimacy to paperwork. And within this new system, women's forms of authority were no longer transferable, the skills that had once mattered. Discretion, mediation, relational intelligence lost value in a world obsessed with documentation and public roles. And so Mughal women appeared to fade from history, not because they had been powerless, but because the world had changed in ways that no longer recognized their power. Colonial governance demanded visibility, signatures, titles, offices, and women were excluded from these by design. The British system narrowed the definition of authority and then judged the past by those narrowed standards. Memory adjusted accordingly. What survived were the loud markers of empire. Battles, treaties, male rulers, and what was lost were the quiet infrastructures that sustained everyday rule. Within families, women continued to shape lives, values, and choices. But history as an archive no longer recorded these interventions. And so silence thickened around Mughal women. Nationalist histories that followed inherited this archive and its gaps. Focused on resistance, rebellion, and sovereignty. All framed through masculine action, women again appeared marginal. Either as symbols of tradition to be protected or as victims to be liberated. Rarely as historical agents in their own right. The complexity of Mughal women's lives did not fit the new narratives of nationhood any more than it had fit colonial narratives of domination. And so the image hardened further. Purdah became timeless, static, ahistorical. A symbol stripped of context and movement. Yet beneath this hardened image lived memories carried in families. Oral traditions, architectural traces, endowments. And local histories, women remembered their grandmothers as estate managers, mediators, patrons, not as prisoners. Shrines funded by women continued to serve communities. Gardens commissioned by royal women remained spaces of leisure and reflection. Inscriptions bearing women's names survived, even when their stories did not. These fragments challenge the idea of total erasure. They suggest continuity beneath silence. But recovering these stories requires a different way of reading history. One that does not privilege only public spectacle. One that understands that power can reside in spaces that leave fewer records. Historians today are slowly beginning to relearn this skill. To read against the grain of colonial archives. To piece together women's lives from correspondence, legal documents, architectural patronage, and household accounts. And when they do, the old image begins to fracture. Mughal women reappear not as anomalies, but as integral components of empire. Their influence uneven, constrained, contested, but real. And this reappearance forces us to confront a larger discomfort. That our own assumptions about freedom and agency may be narrower than we like to believe. We often equate liberation with visibility and resistance with rebellion. But Mughal women remind us that survival and influence can take other forms. Forms shaped by context rather than ideology. This does not mean romanticizing the past or denying inequality. It means acknowledging that human societies generate multiple strategies for navigating power. Some loud, some quiet, some confrontational, some adaptive. And history must account for all of them if it is to be honest. As we reflect on Purdah, we must resist the temptation to judge it solely as symbol, because symbols flatten reality. Purdah functioned differently across time, place, and class. It constrained some women more than others. It protected some while limiting others. It could be both shelter and boundary. And Mughal women understood this ambiguity intimately. They lived inside it, negotiated it. Sometimes suffered under it, sometimes benefited from it, and always responded to it creatively. To reduce this complexity to a single moral verdict is to do violence to their lived experience. The deeper lesson here is about historical humility, about recognizing that our categories are not universal, that our frameworks are products of our own time, and that past societies deserve to be understood before they are judged. Mughal women do not ask us to celebrate or condemn Purdah. They ask us to see it as it was. A practice embedded in a particular world with its own logics and constraints. And when we allow ourselves to see that world more clearly, we begin to see ourselves differently too. Our own assumptions about power, freedom, and voice begin to feel less stable. And perhaps that is the true value of history. Not to provide comfort, but to unsettle. To remind us that human experience is larger than any single narrative. The Mughal women who lived behind screens, who wrote letters, managed estates, shaped emperors, negotiated survival, and left traces still visible if we know where to look. They were not waiting to be rescued by history. They were living inside it, shaping it quietly, deliberately, and often effectively. And as this journey continues beyond this documentary, the question that remains is not whether Mughal women were confined to Purdah, but whether we are confined by the limits of our own historical imagination. Because only when we expand that imagination can the past speak in its full complexity, rather than through the narrow frames we inherited. Now imagine yourself not as a distant observer of Mughal history, but as someone standing at its threshold, aware that everything you think you know about the past has been shaped by stories told long after the people themselves are gone. Because history does not reach us directly. It reaches us filtered through language, power, and repetition. And Mughal women have lived for centuries inside those filters. Their lives translated, simplified, and often misread. When we say Mughal women were confined to Purdah, we are repeating a sentence that sounds factual, but hides 1,000 assumptions. Assumptions about freedom, about voice, about what power is supposed to look like. And those assumptions belong far more to the modern world than to the Mughal one. In the Mughal imagination, society was ordered through hierarchy, proximity, and obligation, not through visibility and equality. Women were not expected to perform authority publicly because authority itself was not understood as performance. It was understood as stewardship, responsibility, and influence exercised through relationships. And Mughal women were trained from an early age to navigate this world. They learned how to read people, how to listen more than they spoke, how to recognize moments when intervention would matter and moments when restraint would protect long-term interests. This kind of intelligence rarely leaves dramatic traces. It does not announce itself in proclamations or monuments bearing a single name. Instead, it survives in continuity, in families that endure, in estates that remain intact, in alliances that do not fracture. And because it leaves fewer spectacular records, later historians often overlook it. But overlooking does not mean absence. It means our tools of observation are incomplete. The modern obsession with resistance as the only form of agency further distorts our reading of the past. We expect women's power to look like defiance, rebellion, or overt challenge to norms, and when it does not, we assume submission. But Mughal women were not seeking to overthrow the system they lived within. They were seeking to survive and shape it. And in a world where open confrontation often led to annihilation, this was not weakness, but strategy. Their choices were shaped by risk, by the need to protect children, households, and futures. And when we judge these choices through the lens of modern ideals, we risk moralizing where we should be understanding. Mughal women did not imagine freedom as escape from society. They imagined it as security within it, the ability to protect oneself and one's kin, the ability to influence outcomes that mattered, the ability to maintain dignity and control under constraint. These were realistic goals in an imperial world defined by volatility and violence. And Purdah became one of the mechanisms through which these goals were pursued. It regulated exposure, minimized risk, and preserved leverage. This does not mean Purdah was experienced uniformly or always positively. Some women undoubtedly experienced it as suffocating, others as protective, many as both at different moments of their lives. But to reduce it to a single emotional experience erases variation in voice. The deeper problem lies not in misunderstanding Purdah alone, but in misunderstanding how historical actors evaluate their own lives. Mughal women did not live as characters in a morality play about oppression and liberation. They lived as people making decisions under pressure, negotiating family expectations, political realities, religious values, and personal desires. And their sense of self-worth was shaped by criteria different from ours: honor, lineage, piety, stability, continuity. When we impose modern metrics of fulfillment onto their lives, we risk misreading their priorities. The task of history is not to validate our present beliefs, but to encounter difference honestly. And Mughal women offer us a profound encounter with difference. They challenge the assumption that empowerment must be visible, that agency must be confrontational, that freedom must resemble modern liberal autonomy. Their lives remind us that influence can be quiet, that strength can be patient, that power can operate through care, mediation, and endurance. And perhaps this is why their stories unsettle us. Because they do not fit comfortably into our preferred narratives. They demand that we widen our understanding of what it means to act, to choose, to matter. As viewers listening to this story, you are not being asked to admire or condemn the Mughal past. You are being asked to recognize its complexity, to hold multiple truths at once. That Mughal society was hierarchical and unequal, and that within it women still exercised meaningful power. That Purdah constrained mobility and also structured authority. That silence can be imposed and also chosen. And that history becomes richer when we resist the urge to simplify. The Mughal women who lived behind screens were not waiting for modern observers to interpret their lives correctly. They were busy living them, shaping outcomes that mattered in their own time. And when we listen carefully, we can still hear traces of that agency. Not in dramatic declarations, but in the persistence of institutions, the survival of families, the endurance of cities, and the subtle continuity of cultural forms. This kind of listening requires patience, humility, and a willingness to sit with ambiguity. And perhaps that is the most important invitation this history offers us. To slow down, to question inherited frames, and to allow the past to remain complex rather than forcing it into familiar shapes. Because only then can history become not a weapon for judgment, but a space for understanding. And only then can the lives of Mughal women emerge not as symbols, but as human stories. Layered, constrained, strategic, and real. Now imagine the Mughal world lingering, not as a finished chapter, but as an echo that continues to shape how we think about gender power and history even today. Because the stories we tell about the past do not stay in the past. They travel forward and quietly organize the present. The image of the Mughal woman behind Purdah has become more than a historical claim. It has become a metaphor used in debates about religion, culture, modernity, and freedom. And yet this metaphor is built on a misunderstanding. When Mughal women are remembered only as confined figures, their real legacy is lost. And that loss matters because it teaches us to look for power only where it resembles our own ideals. The Mughal Empire was a world where power flowed through households, through kinship, through access and trust, not through elections or public institutions. And within this world, women were essential nodes in the network of governance. Their influence shaped emperors' families, trade, religious life, and urban landscapes. This influence did not disappear when the empire fell, it transformed. Fragments of it survived in regional courts and landed families in religious patronage and in social memory. Even today, property records, charitable endowments, and architectural inscriptions quietly testify to women's historical presence. But because these traces do not conform to dramatic narratives, they are often ignored. Modern history education prefers clarity, heroes, villains, and moral lessons. Mughal women disrupt this preference because their lives resist easy categorization. They were neither fully liberated nor entirely oppressed. They lived within constraints and still acted meaningfully. They remind us that agency is not an all-or-nothing condition, but a spectrum shaped by context. This realization is uncomfortable because it complicates modern debates that rely on sharp binaries. Tradition versus modernity, oppression versus freedom, silence versus voice. Mughal women show us that silence can coexist with influence, and that visibility is not the only measure of autonomy. This does not mean that all practices associated with Purdah were benign or empowering. It means that history must be attentive to lived realities rather than symbols. Some women undoubtedly suffered under strict seclusion, especially in later periods when social rigidity increased. Others leveraged Purdah to secure authority, respect, and safety. The same structure could function differently depending on personality, rank, region, and moment in time. Recognizing this variation does not weaken critique, it strengthens it, because it grounds judgment in evidence rather than assumption. The danger of flattening Mughal women into victims is that it strips them of historical dignity. It denies them the capacity to act, to choose, and to shape their own lives within constraint. It also deprives us of learning from their strategies of survival and influence. Strategies that may still resonate in societies where power is uneven and direct confrontation is costly. History is not only a record of triumphs and revolutions, it is also a record of adaptation, negotiation, and endurance. Mughal women were masters of these arts. They navigated volatile political landscapes, familial rivalries, and shifting alliances with patience, intelligence, and restraint. Their successes were measured not in public acclaim, but in continuity in the survival of households, in the stability of estates, and in the shaping of future rulers. These are subtle achievements, but no less real. As modern audiences, we often ask whether Mughal women would have wanted the freedoms we value today. But this question risks projecting our desires onto people who lived under entirely different conditions. Mughal women did not imagine a world of individual autonomy, detached from family and community. They imagined security, dignity, influence, and continuity. Their aspirations were shaped by the realities of empire, where violence was common and power precarious. Judged by those standards, many Mughal women were remarkably successful. To recognize this is not to deny injustice, but to acknowledge competence and resilience. And this acknowledgement matters because it allows us to see historical women as thinkers and actors rather than symbols. The way we remember Mughal women also shapes how contemporary women from similar cultural backgrounds are perceived. Stereotypes about silence, passivity, and lack of agency continue to circulate, often justified by selective readings of history. Correcting the past, therefore, has ethical implications for the present. It challenges the assumption that certain cultures are inherently oppressive and that liberation must come from outside. Mughal women's history suggests that agency can emerge from within cultural frameworks rather than only through rejection of them. This insight invites a more nuanced conversation about gender and power across societies, one that respects difference without romanticizing it. The legacy of Mughal women is not a simple message but a challenge to expand our historical imagination, to recognize forms of power that operate quietly, patiently, and relationally. A challenge to question our reliance on visibility as the primary marker of freedom. And a challenge to approach the past with humility rather than judgment. As this documentary comes toward its close, the most important takeaway is not a verdict on Purdah, but an invitation to rethink how we read history itself. Whose voices we listen for, where we look for power, and how easily we mistake unfamiliar forms of agency for absence. Mughal women lived complex lives in a complex world. Their stories deserve to be told with the same depth, care, and seriousness we grant to emperors and battles. Because without them, the history of the Mughal Empire remains incomplete. And perhaps the final lesson of their lives is this: that power does not always announce itself in the language we expect, and freedom does not always look the way we imagine. But history becomes richer when we learn to recognize both. The story slowly drawing to a close, not with an answer neatly wrapped, but with a question left deliberately open. Because the most powerful histories are not those that tell us what to think, but those that change how we think. And the story of Mughal women and Purdah does exactly that. It asks us to pause before accepting inherited images, to hesitate before repeating familiar claims, and to listen more carefully to voices that history trained us not to hear. When we look back at the Mughal Empire, through this lens, we begin to notice how often women appear at moments of transition rather than spectacle. At the quiet turning points where decisions were shaped rather than announced. A letter sent at the right moment, an intervention made privately, a marriage arranged strategically, a resource redirected, a conflict softened. These actions rarely produce dramatic scenes. They do not lend themselves easily to cinema or slogans, but they are the substance of governance. And Mughal women understood this substance intuitively. They did not measure success by visibility but by outcome. by whether households survived, whether sons lived, whether estates remained intact, whether alliances held. These were not small concerns in an empire where power was unstable and violence ever present. Survival itself required intelligence and foresight, and Mughal women developed both. Their lives remind us that history is not only made by those who stand on battlefields or sit on thrones, but also by those who manage continuity behind the scenes. This realization can be unsettling because it destabilizes heroic narratives. It suggests that power is often exercised by those who never claim it publicly, and that influence can be more effective when it is concealed rather than displayed. As modern viewers, we are accustomed to equating agency with resistance. But Mughal women complicate this equation. Their strategies were often adaptive rather than oppositional, relational rather than confrontational. They worked within structures rather than against them. Not because they lacked imagination, but because they understood risk. This does not make their choices lesser, it makes them contextual. And understanding context is the historian's responsibility. The repeated question of whether Mughal women were confined to Purdah now begins to feel inadequate, too narrow to capture lived reality, because Purdah was not a single experience, but a shifting boundary negotiated daily. For some women, it limited movement and opportunity. For others, it provided protection, authority, and leverage. For many, it was both at different moments of life. Childhood, marriage, motherhood, widowhood. These changes mattered. Yet simplified narratives freeze women in a single moment and deny them growth and adaptation. The cost of such freezing is high. It turns history into caricature and deprives present audiences of learning from the past. Mughal women navigated uncertainty with tools that remain relevant: patience, timing, discretion, emotional intelligence. These are not qualities celebrated in histories of conquest, but they are essential to human survival. By overlooking them, we impoverish our understanding of power itself. The persistence of the Purdah myth also reveals something about modern anxieties. It reflects discomfort with forms of agency that do not resemble modern liberal ideals. It reveals a preference for stories where freedom is loud and oppression is obvious, but history often resists such clarity. Mughal women lived in a world where moral and political choices were constrained by factors beyond individual control: family obligation, imperial violence, religious norms. Yet within these constraints, they found ways to matter. Recognizing this does not excuse inequality, it contextualizes it. And context is what transforms judgment into understanding. As this documentary reaches its final moments, the invitation is not to arrive at a verdict, but to carry forward a more careful way of seeing, to question easy binaries, to look for power in unexpected places, to recognize that silence does not always mean absence, and that privacy does not always mean powerlessness. Mughal women were not waiting for history to rescue them from obscurity. They were living lives shaped by their own priorities and risks. And if history later failed to record them fully, that failure belongs to historians, not to them. The task now is not to replace one myth with another, but to hold complexity without fear. To allow Mughal women to exist as historical actors rather than symbols. To see Purdah not as a moral verdict, but as a social practice embedded in a specific world. And to accept that understanding the past requires humility. Because the past does not owe us affirmation, it owes us truth. And truth is often more complicated than the stories we inherit. When we allow ourselves to sit with that complication, the Mughal world opens up in new ways. Its women step out of the shadows not to perform, freedom for modern audiences, but to remind us that history is richer when we learn to see quietly exercised power. And perhaps that is the final gift of this journey. Not an answer to whether Mughal women were confined to Purdah, but a deeper awareness of how easily we confine the past within our own assumptions, and how much we gain when we let it speak back to us on its own terms.